All right, well, welcome to our third of three webinars on the Mining the Climate Crisis series. And we've been having conversations with folks about international dimensions of metal recycling. We've talked to some local experts and legislators about options in Minnesota to increase our recycling and reuse of already mined minerals. And today we're having a really interesting and broad-ranging conversation with three amazing people who are real leaders on a variety of questions about climate action, what we're calling climate action beyond extraction. So much of the conversation over the last few months, especially, but I think over the last several decades, has been about what do we build? How do we build our way out of the climate crisis? But there's a lot bigger conversation to be had about how we approach the climate crisis and go beyond extractivism as a solution and to think about other ways that we can address the climate crisis in our own lives and with policy. And so we're really excited to have three amazing panelists to discuss that. This conversation is fueled by MCEA supporters, and we really appreciate your work that allows us to take on these complex issues with global and local impact in the way that we are doing here, especially on where we're going to get the materials for the clean energy and EV revolution without destroying the environment that we're trying to protect. So please consider a contribution, mncenter.org/donate if you're so interested. Also, we're turning these conversations into videos and podcasts, and so if you want to share this conversation that you heard today with some of your friends, or you want to hear it in a different format, we'll have both podcasts and video available. We'll have this video up on our YouTube channel later today, and we will be launching this podcast series later this month. So thanks so much for your support that allows us to do that. One last little item is that our next webinar will be next Tuesday at noon, same time, same place, same bat channel. But it'll be about the legislature and what's happening at the Minnesota legislature this session. So if you're interested in Minnesota legislative issues, we encourage you to tune back in next Tuesday at noon on the 31st for our first in the series of legislative webinars. So what we have planned today is to hear from these three panelists on three big topics. We're going to have a lightning round at the end. We're going to ask them to respond quickly to a couple of topic questions, and then we'll talk about your questions as audience members. And when the conversation about climate action spurred on by the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act really got going, it's been so focused on building stuff and resources that are needed to build stuff, particularly metals. And climate action is so much more than that. It can include things like doing less and consuming less, and that needs to be part of the conversation as well. So we have three amazing panelists, and I'm going to introduce them briefly and ask them to introduce themselves for about a minute or so. And I'm going to start with Winona LaDuke. She's the leader of Honor of the Earth, an MIT-educated economist, a former vice presidential candidate, and a leader in developing alternative economic ventures that are rooted in sustainable development. And welcome, Winona. Would you like to introduce yourself further?
Ani Nindoy Maganada, hello, my relatives. Happy to be here today to talk about the future, how we're going to think for the 7 generations ahead, because that's pretty much the sound way to think. And I'm happy to be here for this conversation. I'm from the White Earth Reservation, and I'm a water protector.
Thank you. Dr. Jennifer Dunn is an associate professor and the director of the Center for Engineering, Sustainability, and Resilience at Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois. And Dr. Dunn, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you. So I'm a chemical engineer, and I lead a research group at Northwestern that studies emerging technologies and their social and environmental effects. We examine many different types of emerging technologies, like new types of plastics, different technologies to recover resources from water. We're also doing a lot of thinking about energy storage technologies and the minerals that they require.
Great. Thank you so much for being with us today, Dr. Dunn. Our last panelist is Dr. Libby Bent, who is a founding member of Duluth for Clean Water, a PhD-educated chemist who brings deep local perspective on water issues in her work, both as an inorganic chemist and as an advocate for water sustainability and water protection in Duluth. Dr. Bent, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you, Aaron. I'm also happy to be here. My Duluth for Clean Water story is that when we moved to Minnesota from Western New York in 2014, I was seeing just how quickly a large lake could become impaired as massive algal blooms formed in Lake Erie. And what I soon learned, and I'm sure you all know, is that even immense and deep and cold Lake Superior is surprisingly vulnerable and is one of the fastest warming lakes in the world. So the long-term damage from upstream mining would be permanent and irreversible. And those of us with Lake Superior water that is in our blood have an extra obligation to those waters and ecosystems that are not ours to sacrifice.
Thank you. That's really well said. Appreciate it. So the format today is a little bit more dynamic than we've had previously. So usually we've been asking questions of individual panelists and asking each one of them to respond to specific questions. Today, we're going to do it a little bit differently in more of a roundtable format where I'll be putting out a topic and then tossing it to one of the panelists to start. But we want every one of you to weigh in on each of these questions and to engage with each other's ideas as well. So please feel free to build off what other folks are talking about, take it in whatever direction you want to go, and I'll do my best to kind of keep things moving along the path. And so we're going to start with the first topic, and just as a kind of prelude to that topic, so much of the discussion about climate action, especially recently, has been about big construction needs, engineering solutions, building new infrastructure, transportation, electrical, and otherwise. And all of that is probably necessary, or parts of that will be necessary. But we didn't get here with the climate crisis just because we didn't build things. In some cases, we built the wrong things. In some cases, we destroyed critical natural systems in the name of progress. And I guess this is a really broad topic, but I think I'm interested in hearing each of your perspectives on it, which is what are the limitations to this current approach to climate solutions? What are we missing in this conversation? And I'd like to toss that to Winona LaDuke to start.
So first, just really pleased to be with everybody. I already said that, but when I learned more about you, I was like, oh, that's, we lived here for a long time, 1,000 years without messing anything up, right? When your ancestors came, you could drink the water from every streaming creek. There's wild rice in abundance. And, so this, first of all, lack of recognition of what's here is fundamentally the problem. Like I hear people talk about the economy of Minnesota as being like mining, agriculture, and energy. I was like, no, the economy of Minnesota is wild rice, it's water, it's forests that are intact. So remember who we are and what we have that the Creator gave us here. That's the first thing is instead of trying to like how you live over a long economy that's based on what you got or what the Creator gave you instead of trying to make up something else. The second thing is, it's interesting. I just went and took 65 kids who were on the Dakota 38 ride. I took them to see Avatar, The Way of the Water, right? Which was kind of a gamble because everybody could really not like you or they could like you at the end of it, right? Yay! But we saw it in Mankato after we finished this ride. And, what I think about is this unobtainium. And that's what it's like in Minnesota. It's like the constant pursuit of unobtainium, like some new technological fix to fit into some addiction. And the fact is that we're the most inefficient energy economy, and the choices in Minnesota and elsewhere are like preposterous. So let me just give you an example. The single largest energy consumer in the state of Minnesota, that would be Enbridge. Wait, did I say that right? Enbridge. Single largest energy consumer in the state of Minnesota because moving sludge takes power. Nobody asks what we use the power for, or just maybe a second question is like, that's right, mining consumes gigantic amounts of energy. And they said it's about 80% of world's electricity could be just like extreme mining operations. What am I saying? Decisions on what is worth energy, what is worth our, work, and let's be, more efficient. And then obviously, the technological solutions, I'm a hemp farmer. That's your solution. Hemp could save the world. And, I'm going to count on Jennifer to help me in this next round of, as the innovations between recycling and hemp. But I'm saying, like, let's rethink what we're doing. Why are we acting like a bunch of crazy people, addicts, and doing more and more crazy stuff in Minnesota when, in fact, we could do something cool, like restore, cut big energy users who are destructive, like the mining industry, the oil companies, and then get back to some basic energy planning that makes sense. Anyway, that's kind of like my first take on that question.
Yeah, it's good. It's a good take. And I just want to add to support what you're saying that, I've been at the legislature and listened to the mining industry testify that one mine in northern Minnesota uses more electricity than the entire city of Minneapolis on a daily basis.
Right. It's like crazy energy equation.
Yeah, it's wild to think about. Dr. Dunn, you have what do you think are limitations to our current approach to this conversation about climate solutions?
I think that, so I am an engineer, of course, so I tend to focus on technology solutions. And I think that one thing that I've taken away from like strategic planning exercises, right, is you think about your end state. What do you want your end state to be? And then you think about all the ways to get there. So we've said that we want an end state, of net zero by 2050. But then the pathways that we conceive of to get to that end state don't necessarily account for scenarios in which we might be able to consume less or do things that might be quite expensive. For example, building better public transit networks or light rail or things along those lines that would really change how we live. And that's really, something that's very hard to conceive of. But I think it's worth keeping those doors open in our brains because it's easy even for me to be like, oh, that will never happen. But if we really want to get to that end state, as you're pointing out, the things we envision building and technologies to fix things don't always work, or they take longer to get to the point where we can actually use them than we thought it might. And so I think it's really important to keep, when we say like keep all options on the table, those options should include a lot of things, technologies, but also changes in how we live and how we think of a good life, I guess.
Yeah, that's well said. Libby, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I was thinking as Winona was talking that sometimes what we need to do is to do less and listen and observe more. And I love how in Braiding Sweetgrass, Robin Kimmerer tells us to look to the other species for guidance. They've been on the earth far longer and have had time to figure things out. And I was reading recently that it turns out the best hydrologists are about 3 feet long with strong teeth and no necks. A beaver wetland has a third more biodiversity and holds 9 times more water. So humans like to direct water to flow, within confined banks and in a certain direction. But beavers are like, nah, let's build a dam here and put in some canals out here. So you might not want to put a housing project there. And then stormwater spreads out through the canals, sinks into the aquifers, and the marshes act like huge sponges, preventing drought and flooding, cleansing water pollutants. So beavers give us a master class in hydrology, if we just take the time to see it. And I was thinking too that in terms of people that have been here longer, we need to follow the success. We need to return land and decision-making to the 4% of the population, the native people who protect 80% of the world's biodiversity, because they have this time-proven record and the time-tested scientific knowledge to sustain the plants and the animals that sustain us. And this generational knowledge has had the most high-stakes peer review process of all, survival.
It's really well said. I like that a lot. And, I think it really is a challenge too, because
That's great, Libby.
Yeah, I think that's awesome. It really does highlight some of the things we're missing in this conversation, about climate change and the honestly radical revisioning we're going to have to do with some of the unsustainable practices that we've adopted over the last 100, 150, 200 years. And I think it's a really kind of a scary prospect for a lot of folks. How do we get folks to open their minds to some of these broader ideas or different ideas that might not fit the boxes that they're currently in? I know it's just kind of a thought I'm having, and I'm wondering if any of you have a reaction to it.
Well, a couple of things. First of all, we refer to it as a structural adjustment, because everybody wants to do structural adjustments for like the South. But I'm like, how about the North? Looks like they need a pretty big structural adjustment in their economy and their mechanisms and their, that's just like, we call it the Sitting Bull plan, not the Marshall Plan or the New Green Deal, but it's like, you need some mega infrastructure. But at the basic level, a lot of our strategy is show people it's possible, because all of the PR firms like Talon Minerals are out there talking about how, this is the future. And so there's this dystopian future view that is presented continuously. And the more that we illustrate that, hemp gives you batteries, hemp sequesters carbon, why do you need a car? What I'm saying is that the more we develop what is really a land-based economy in Minnesota, we had the last green revolution there. Let's have the new green revolution in Minnesota with hemp. I'm just saying this, like, you got to do it. You got to do it. You got to support it. You got to finance it, Libby and Jennifer, I'm sure, have more to say about it, but.
I think it's really quite difficult, right, to think about large scale societal change. But the other thing that I think is interesting is, like, you can't predict the disruptors that are going to come along and how they might change things, like potentially for the better. And so I think it's part of like our role as people who are at this forefront of these discussions to think about, well, what could be the disruptors that would bring about those changes. But again, it's a very challenging situation. And I think, after watching the pandemic unfold and sort of the collective action that we needed to take, that was difficult to make happen for a very near-term urgency need. I think the fact that climate change, although we are seeing very severe effects of climate change right now in our country, it's hard for people to appreciate that this is really an urgent thing that needs action now, as opposed to 5 years from now, 10 years from now. No, now we really need to be doing things and targeting the big ticket items in terms of greenhouse gases. But at the same time, while doing that, as we're talking about now, thinking about, well, what are the other consequences that could arise from doing that?
And I don't want to just keep on putting it back to you, but I think that the next topic really actually starts with some of the work that you're doing on life cycle analysis and the work that you do, which is, we get, one old saying is you get action on what you measure. One big improvement in climate action is that we're getting better at measuring climate pollution, but we're so focused on emissions only. It's a very narrow approach. It risks putting other values, people, and natural systems at risk. So what are we not measuring right now? We're talking about climate action, and what should we be measuring? And I'm wondering if you can kick us off on that, Dr. Dunn.
Yeah, my pleasure. So as you know, I've been thinking a lot about this in the context of electric vehicles. And I started doing what's called life cycle assessment of electric vehicles, I think around 2010 or 2011. And even back then, when we look at per mile emissions of greenhouse gases from a vehicle, and you compare that number for an electric vehicle to a gasoline powered car, you get less greenhouse gas emissions per mile, which is great. We want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from our cars. But I was writing this study up for publication. I thought to myself, I need to go look at the supply chain for these minerals that are in the batteries. So I'm a chemical engineer. It's not something we typically cover in what we learn about in school. And so I started learning about mining. And then I really started thinking oh, this is going to require a lot more mining if we go after this in a big way. And now we are. And so I really felt it was quite important to bring some of these questions to the forefront. And of course, I'm not the only one raising these points, but to pursue greenhouse gas reductions from cars, we will need to mine more, whether here in the US or elsewhere. And we need to be aware of the potential negative social and environmental effects that can come from that mining. So in policies that look to limit greenhouse gas emissions, they're very focused on, for example, at per mile greenhouse gas emissions number, but they're not necessarily taking into account, well, to get to that lower number, we are needing to expand mining, which could have very deleterious effects on water quality. And so, yes, we need to, when we're thinking about either expanding a mine or building a new mine, we need to be collecting very rigorously water quality data and other data along those lines, in addition to thinking about how it's affecting communities, which may not be so much of an issue in terms of job creation or delocalization, but maybe that's more of an issue in other countries with less stringent labor laws. But it's really important to just think about those issues that could arise in advance and decide what we want to measure and then measure it. And we want to try and be sure that we are not making things worse. So we need a course corrective mechanism in our policies. We need to be thinking about these things in advance, even despite the very urgent situation with climate change. We need to be looking at multiple factors.
It reminds me that the Fond du Lac Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa, who's downstream of the Polymet mine proposal, several years back commissioned an economic study of the ecosystem services provided by the St. Louis River. And the number is just eye-popping. I mean, it's in the multiple billions of dollars. But it's also not something that people oftentimes think about as an actual economic value. I don't know, if Libby or if Winona, if you have thoughts about ecosystem services as one of those things we should be measuring.
I like the story of the beavers. I mean, that's a fact, is that we still have biodiversity in Minnesota. A lot of places in the world don't have biodiversity, and biodiversity is life. And so in order to not only survive, to survive, you got to protect the wild things, because that's where the life is in these ecosystems in the north. And that's why it's so significant what we do in Minnesota and around our sacred Great Lakes. The other thing is that, and I think that Jennifer, you were talking about this is just this rethinking, because there's just this one story that's being told. And I'm a big fan of the electric train. I'm a huge fan of the electric train. It's the most efficient, we just, we're just a bunch of dummies the way we get around. and then the question is like direct, I don't know, the solutionary rail guys, you must have followed them, Jennifer, but they're like, we're going to direct power them, those trains with wind turbines right by them, distributed energy, distributed power. I mean, and I also feel like that this moment in time, as the grid goes down, more and more people are getting, smartened up that the systems don't work. And so the more that we can really demand a resilient energy system in Minnesota that addresses, fuel poverty, addresses the fact that the grids are going down, the more we can build that system, the better off, obviously, we're going to be. And then as we build that, let's ask these questions like, where's this power going? I remember at one point they were going to put in a bunch of wind power in South Dakota. PUC approved it in South Dakota for the Keystone pipeline. I was like, that doesn't count. You don't get to like power tar sands pipelines with renewable energy and call it a good, so.
Yeah, there's been a lot of PR push around Enbridge's Line 3 that I remember saying like, oh, we're using, solar panels to power it.
Yeah, like putting lipstick on a pig,
Challenge. One other way to think about this too is that we've started to just de-link, climate action from water protection, from habitat protection, from other environmental and social goals, social justice goals that are important to us. I mean, how do we start to relink these things? How do we start to get them in people's minds together, that we can't just separate out one measure of climate action from other values that we really need to hold dear to if we want to survive?
Yeah, one thing I think we need to do is create a vision for how great things are going to be when it's regenerative and when we are living a lower energy life. And I was thinking about this biodiversity, Winona, that there used to be equal treatment for land alteration and atmosphere pollution, but the land change piece was complex. It was difficult to model. And so the group that formed to study it, that was the counterpart to the IPCC, they were disbanded and they no longer exist. And the problem is that the biodiversity crisis is hard to tackle because it's complex. It requires more humility and restraint. In mid-March, in less than 2 months in the US, we'll hit ecological overshoot, which means we'll exhaust nature's budget for the entire year. So if everyone lived as we do, we'd need more than 5 Earths. And I think, things come down to trade-offs. If I was listening to what you were saying about the batteries and EVs, and just the batteries themselves weigh 1,000 to 3,000 pounds. And that's on top of vehicles that have been increasing in mass for the last 40 years. And the ones that are used in the largest vehicles in the higher end cars use nickel because it provides longer driving range. And there is a trade-off there between nickel and cobalt. But in any case, you tend to use a lot of nickel for these cars. And the thing is that we have choices. We can opt for standard range cars that use these lithium iron phosphate batteries. They're called LFPs, that don't use nickel or cobalt. And we can reject this notion that car companies love to promote, that we need like 400 horses to move one person around town. We can mainstream lighter and more affordable cars for city life, and we can prioritize safe and accessible ways to move around without cars.
We certainly have a long history of using one horse to move one person around. It's not exactly a long, but it's kind of amazing to see like the ways in which these electric technologies are being bolted onto what were really unsustainable transportation technologies to start with, and then being deemed sustainable because they are now have an electric battery powering them as opposed to gasoline. And that's probably a big area we need to keep on thinking about too. What's the risk of baking in like kind of unsustainable and dangerous technologies with this really dominant narrow focus we're having right now on mining and minerals and extractivism as the solution? I mean, what are some of these solutions that you see out there, and I'll put solutions in quotation marks here, that you feel like we're at risk of baking into our solution mix because of our current approach? Besides the ones we've already mentioned, of course.
I just think that in any solution that people are thinking about, it's important to really, I talk about life cycle assessment and thinking about all media, air, water, land, and just sitting down even qualitatively and thinking out like what could be the impacts. And now the world is so interconnected with supply chains. And if we go back to the example of minerals, it's especially true. And so in a way, the government is working to address some of this through some of their recent policy, but there is somewhat of an energy security risk in coming to lean on these minerals, which is, again, recognized, and there's work going on to try and deal with that. But I think it's just important to think about these things holistically. And when you think about choices among energy types, there's just so many trade-offs, right? And so, it can get to the point where it's difficult to kind of keep track of them all. So I think whatever we can do to help policymakers and the general public try and understand these trade-offs, I think that will help avoid getting things baked in. I'm a mother. My children are like middle high school is my oldest one, and they've not yet addressed really climate change in any meaningful way in school, which I find really surprising. And so we're not, first of all, they're going to be the ones kind of experiencing it. So we're not really preparing them for that, but we're also not talking about, we need people to design both technological and societal solutions. And here's the things we need to think about when you're doing that. That communication's at least not happening where I live. Of course, my kids know because I tell them all about it. But yeah, I just think that we're not necessarily doing all we can with the younger generation to help them be prepared and be like careful thinkers. And they're, like Libby said, envisioning their ideal future and what it will take to get there.
Yeah. So we've talked a lot about different ways to broaden this conversation. I thought there were some really excellent examples that Libby, you brought up earlier about the beaver particularly. And as the idea that nature-based solutions might offer more for us to consider that we're not currently thinking about in our conversation about climate action. What kind of nature-based solutions are you excited about, and what are some ways that we can help to relink climate action with other important values about preserving and protecting these natural systems that we're all part of? I'll start with Dr. Benton. We'll pass it around to the rest of the folks.
Yeah, the nature-based solution, there's an exciting way that we can do that. And I want to just touch briefly first on living in cities, what we can do since we produce 75% of CO2 emissions, that we really need to think and act locally and act quickly. So a few of the things I see doing would be to create a grid of slow streets that would be mostly for non-motorized traffic. That just uses existing infrastructure. And you identify streets that you just give back to the people. Those are going to be the fun streets with kids and seniors and bikes and snowboard things. And because we're not going to use salts, there'll be snowpack. Make public transit free and accessible. Give every person who wants one an e-cargo bike. And where does that money come from? We have street repairs, fossil fuel subsidies, new infrastructure, billions used for highway expansions that just bring more traffic. We can't reach our climate goals without reducing vehicle miles traveled. We need to provide access for repair. So the easiest thing to make something greener is to use it for a long time. So right to repair laws. Now cars are transmitting data directly to manufacturers and repair shops, and the owners of the cars need to have access to that information. And then recycling, it's technically possible to recover over something like 90% of metals that EV batteries use. So there's a great potential to reduce primary demand, and it's clear that we have a whole lot more recycling to do and a whole lot more reducing to do before we end up jeopardizing Minnesota's fresh water. And in terms of a nature-based solution that I love for city life and suburban life is that we can create a 20 million acre homegrown national park by planting half of our sterile, unproductive lawns with native species. Entomologist and wildlife ecologist Doug Tallamy has a website. It's homegrownnationalpark.org, and it makes clear no experience is necessary. Anyone with some soil can get started. You don't have to do it all at once or wait 400 years for an oak tree to mature. One of my favorite slides from a presentation that he gives shows a pin oak that has just popped up above the soil, and there's a little caterpillar standing on the ground eating the leaves. And the birds need caterpillars, especially baby birds, and these insects have evolved along with the native plants specifically adapted to one type. So let's follow the squirrels and plant acorns and turn off outdoor lights. In the lower 48 states, we've taken like 95% of the natural world and made it unnatural. And species are lost in that same proportion. So you can see where we're headed. So I guess my vision would just be, as we electrify everything, let's focus on listening and learning from nature and native knowledge, more native plants and plant-based diets, urban farms, more biking, walking, people on the streets, public transportation, light, nimble EVs, sharing, repairing, repurposing, more community and more joy.
Wow. I mean, that's a wonderful vision. And I think when you put it all into one big package, it gets a lot easier for folks to get their head around what a world could look like in the future. And I think that's one of our biggest challenges is just our lack of imagination. I mean, especially when you think about little interventions, like in Minneapolis, we have open streets where for just a day, we close off the street and let people walk on it and talk to people and have fun on it. And it's amazing how that's in that one little moment, it transforms that space, which is usually a really grim automotive killing field at times, into a joyful place where people are interacting with each other and seeing what the potential might be for the future. Winona, I know you've done a lot of work on hemp, and particularly you mentioned hemp batteries a couple times throughout this. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the work that you've been doing at White Earth and elsewhere on trying to develop some more nature-based solutions to some of the problems that we're talking about today.
Yeah, I mean, of course, I mean, a couple of things. So I have like these things that have, so the materials economy is troublesome to me. It's like, we got a lot of stuff. We don't need all this stuff. And so like, I give you a perfect example. A long time ago, I was like in Vanuatu, happiest country in the world, some little island. And what did those guys do? They had a brewery. Oh, that's right. They just refilled the bottles. That is a perfect example of an energy equation. You don't need to crush a glass bottle and remake it and call it recycling, just reuse it. And Bayard Brewery in Missoula does that. I've been wanting somebody in the cities to do that, somebody enlightened to like just refill the damn bottles, right? I mean, there's like so many choices. And then, you know, again, I'm a hemp farmer, but, you know, I start with the fact that farming, if you're under 80 acres, is best done with a couple of horses. It's an energy equation issue, like how much energy you put into it and what's the most sustainable practices. But, you know, we all know that RDO Offit and the big energy, you know, the big ag guys in Minnesota, they have a different model. Agriculture in Minnesota needs to be addressed and challenged and scaled back and scaled down. And if they're doing big, they need to grow hemp. Why do I keep saying hemp? You know, I didn't used to think about hemp so much. People told me about it all these years. And then I was like, oh my God, they're so right. Minnesota used to have 11 hemp mills. Did I just say that? We had 11 hemp mills. The last ones, of course, were in Winona, Minnesota. So that makes me kind of proud. But the point is that that's what we need again, you know, because they made everything. The word canvas comes from cannabis. So for crying out loud, all them tarps, all them sails, all that stuff, well, that could, you know, all those canoes, that could all be like hemp. You know, and in the meantime, it sequesters carbon at a faster rate than any other row crop, and it just grows so damn fast that it's like, you know, the answer for sequestering carbon, as well as to supercapacitors and batteries because of its specific chemical nature. When you turn it into a biochar, it's the stuff. So what's my point? New green revolution. That's what we call it, the new green revolution. And that's what we need in Minnesota, is the new green revolution with hemp in it and everything else that's cool. And I really think that we all should sponsor some forums and some events that talk about the vision for the new green economy, the new green revolution, because the narrative is being, you know, greenwashed, not even like that. It's just being sullied by Rio Tinto Zinc. You don't want Rio Tinto Zinc developing your policy for sustainability in Minnesota. You know, Enbridge and Rio Tinto Zinc, those should be outlaws. They're criminals. You know, let the people like us, you know, be the ones that develop it.
Dr. Dunn, you have more to add here?
Oh, yeah, I'll just make a comment that Winona brought up hemp going to basically graphite, right, for using that in batteries. And that's a great way to use biomass. In fact, so graphite is among the materials that you need to build a battery. And we, based on the calculations that we've done in my research group, we won't have enough to meet projected demand in like the next 5 to 15 years if we lean on just what we have here and what we purchase from our free trade country partners, which is are the stipulations in the Inflation Reduction Act. So for a battery to be in a vehicle that's tax credit eligible, the critical minerals it contains, including graphite, 80% of their market value needs to be from the US, from a free trade country, or from recycling. Someone else brought up, so I'll mention that too. But yeah, so we're going to be a little bit short on graphite. We don't mine it here. We can make it from pet coke and coal tar pitch, which are both fossil fuels. So if we want to go the bio-based route, you know, using hemp to make graphite could both solve a supply chain issue and enhance the sustainability of graphite. It's not a nature-based solution per se, although some people look at microbial-based recycling of batteries, but for sure, recycling of lithium-ion batteries from cars, from other devices, whatever we can get our hands on to get back is really important. Nonetheless, those supplies will not be adequate to meet demand for still quite some time, because when you build a battery, stick it in a car, it's going to hang around for a while in that car. So it'll take time for those batteries to come out of stock. And recycling is a maturing technology. There's still a ways to go in terms of R&D, and there's still a ways to go in establishing a network of recycling across the nation that works. So those are things I'm looking forward to seeing continuing to evolve.
Awesome. That's a really well said. And I think, our earlier, if you're interested in diving a little bit deeper into some of the metal recycling side of things, the first two webinars in this series really look at it from both a state and local perspective, but also a global perspective. So that's worth taking a look at. I want to shift us to our last round, which I'm going to call the lightning round. But we're going to try to get some quick responses from each of our panelists on a couple of topics. And then we'll turn to audience questions. And so we've already got 38 questions in there. That's probably we're not going to get to all of them, but we'll do our best to get to a few that are there, and we'll try to address them as we go along. But we'll start with our lightning round. And I'm just going to go around and give a rapid fashion, and I'll just kick it to each of you to give 10, 15-second responses. I know that's really hard. So do your best, and we'll see how far we go with this. But we'll start with Libby, and I'll ask, what's one thing Minnesota should focus more on in terms of climate action? We'll start with you.
This won't surprise you. More focus on biology conservation and habitat fragmentation, because biodiversity action is climate action.
Got it. Dr. Dunn, what do you think? What's one thing Minnesota should focus on more in terms of climate action? Now, you're not from Minnesota, but we'll give you a pass.
I'm not. I did look up the GHG inventory, though. And the last year of it was 2018, and electricity was one of the top emitters. So I would say continuing push towards electricity from wind and solar and geothermal. I'm not just sure geothermal works in Minnesota. I don't know, honestly. So, but yeah, renewable resources for electricity, or just continuing to reduce demand.
Awesome. Winona, what do you think? What's one thing Minnesota should focus more on in terms of climate action?
Right, those two ladies had it down. Those two things, and then just add some hemp in and let's sequester some carbon, Minnesota. Let's be the new green revolution. That'd be like so cool, But those other biodiversity and cutting our demand, we got to do that. Retire them old dirty coal plants.
Agreed. And I'm very happy to see that at the legislature right now, they're debating a bill that hopefully by the end of next week will be in place to put Minnesota on the path to 100% clean energy. And if you're interested in that, come back next week on Tuesday to hear more at the next webinar as well. What's one climate solution, in quotation marks, that we should stop talking about or putting resources toward? And we'll just go back in reverse. We'll start with Winona this time, if you don't mind.
I didn't hear the question. I'm sorry.
No,
okay.
What's one climate solution, in quotation marks? It's not really a solution that we should stop talking about or putting resources toward.
That we need to stop talking about?
Yeah.
Mining.
Okay. Dr. Dunn, what do you think?
This might be unpopular, but I think that the economics behind carbon capture and sequestration are pretty challenging in the absence of a policy that really pushes them towards favorability. So also it kind of depends on us continuing to emit. So I see the importance of it from that's how we get numbers down. If you do the modeling out, it's really important, foundation of decarbonization, but all the same, it relies on ongoing consumption, and the economics aren't necessarily super favorable, although I know that's changing to some extent. But anyway, that's the one that is kind of, maybe not so high on my list of things to do.
Got it. Dr. Ben, what do you think?
Yeah, it's funny because I had jotted down low-grade ore mining and carbon capture and storage in the sense, not the hemp sense, but in the sense that we can't depend on it. If we continue to emit it, the numbers don't work. We can't get it down. We have to lower emissions.
Yeah, I'm always struck by the fact that carbon capture and sequestration, that's what coal is and oil is. It's already captured carbon that's sitting there. It's been captured and sequestered below the surface. Maybe we just stop burning it. That might be one possible way to approach that too. Who's a person we need to be listening to more on climate action? We'll just go back again. We'll start with Dr. Ben.
Oh, I would say we should, in addition to the non-people on the planet, we should be paying attention to some of these scientists who are out of the labs and on the streets. There's an astrophysicist turned earth scientist, Peter Kalmus. He wrote a book called Being the Change, and it's worth taking a look at.
Dr. Dunn, who's one person we should be listening to more?
I'm a fan of Katharine Hayhoe. That's kind of an easy answer, but she's my favorite.
Got it. Winona, do you have a person in mind that we should be listening to more on climate action?
I just feel like you should be looking at what Native people are doing, you know, and it's kind of more of a collective.
Yeah, understood. What's one thing you won't sacrifice in the name of emissions reductions for climate? Dr. Bent, you want to start us off on this one?
Okay, so if you told me, Aaron, that you needed to destroy or degrade thousands of acres of Minnesota's wetlands, that you needed 6.2 billion gallons of our fresh water every year, and in the best case scenario would release 16 million gallons of toxic water into our groundwater, and that you would need to treat water indefinitely upstream of Lake Superior in order to mine disseminated sulfide deposits containing less than 1% metals in the name of the green energy economy, I'd have to tell you thank you for inquiring, but that sacrifice is too great.
You have just described the polymet proposal. Very well done. Very well done. Dr. Dunn, you have thoughts about what's one thing you won't sacrifice in the name of emissions reductions?
So I have a less profound answer, I guess. For me, I drive 15 miles to work every day so that I can continue to live in the same spot so my kids can finish out their schools. It pains me that I'm a single driver in a car, driving like that every week, but until the kids are done with high school, I'm going to keep doing that even though I'm not super pleased about it.
Got it. Winona, what's one thing you won't sacrifice in the name of emissions reductions?
It's a difficult question. I mean, I won't sacrifice. I mean, I basically transform the world to try to keep things going good. But am I saying, like, one thing that really bothers me is the hydro dam thing? Like, we'll just solve it with doing a bunch of big hydro. And I said, I'm not going to sacrifice the rivers so that we could pretend that we have renewable energy in Minnesota. I'm not going to drown the North.
Well said. Thank you. So this has been a lot of fun. I'm excited to get to some of the audience questions. We've got about 15 minutes left, which I think is great. So if you haven't already added your question to the Q&A box, feel free to do so, and I'll do my best to get to a few of these questions. I'm going to start with Patrick's question, and I don't know if any of you have thoughts about this and want to weigh in, but I think it's an interesting one. What local efforts do you know of for large-scale rewilding, right? And he mentions Scotland as a place where this is already occurring, but one of the other things too is about restoring the ecological function of our natural lands, and it involve taking some land out of production into more of a wild state. So what are some local efforts you know of or ideas that you would want people to know about for rewilding? And anyone can jump in here.
I mean, I feel like Libby was talking about the gardens, you know, or getting rid of lawns. Those are criminal. Lawns are criminal. She's right, you know. And then from us, you know, I don't think you got to rewild. You just got to keep the wild in Minnesota. That'd be great.
You need that. You need that too, for sure. But I think we have so many areas, like for example, we do a lot of work on agricultural drainage, and some of the solutions for agricultural drainage and the impact that it's having on the rivers is to build these giant retention ponds. But really, that's just doing the work that wetlands once did, that we destroyed in the first place. You know, so I think that's a good example of ways in which reinvigorating and getting these natural systems back in place is one way to deal with a problem that humans have created.
Bring the beavers back.
Beavers.
I was just going to say, I do worry just a little bit about the mindset that this 30 by 30 goal, you know, protect 30% of the land by 2030 creates, because it sort of, I think it brings to mind fencing off 30% of the land and then carry on as usual with the other 70%. So we're sort of saying, do we honor 1/3 of the earth or less than 1/3 of the earth? You know, I think we need to, again, follow the success and follow the way that the land has been cared for millennia, and live with the land, coexist with nature.
So Kevin asks, I love what I'm hearing, but I also feel like it's a worldview that's so different from the dominant view in the US. It feels kind of fringe, as he says. And how do you compete with this dominant worldview that's out there? What does it look like, and how can we adopt it? And I think that's a really big topic for conversation, but it might be worth grappling a little bit with. So what do folks think about that?
I might play my engineer card, which is like, I don't know. But I have interesting conversations with people who, you know, are more in the social sciences, who I feel like have kind of more insights there. yeah, so I turn to those who have more expertise.
I think we make it fun. We create this vision and we start to implement it and we just do what we need to do locally. And then people are like, wow, that looks like a good way to live. I don't know any other way to like top down do this.
I think that's a really great point, Libby. Like, for example, you know, having a Tesla is something that many people consider fun or looks fun and they want one. And so, yeah, that type of creating of a fun and cool and wonderful thing to do, I think is really good to be a model and an example.
I think that's spot on, you know, because people see they're afraid or someone gave them too much Kool-Aid and they think that this is the only way they can live, you know, and then you're like, hey, try a farmer's market. What if that was a local cheese and it wasn't brought to you by Kraft? You know what I'm saying? Is like all of those have climate implications, and the cooler we make being local, the better off we're going to be. You know, I mean, that's kind of like the rest of the world has a lot of that, and we turned into the big corporate state. So be cool, be local.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important to note that, you know, oftentimes the rhetoric around what we need to do in response to climate change is to do less of something or to take things away, quote unquote, from people. And they think this is something that they're going to have to give up. It's going to be a traumatic thing. And I think it's really important to think about how you describe these alternative ways of living and addressing the climate crisis in ways that make it sound like, not just sound like, but make it, I mean, help people understand how it's fun and how it's different and how it'd be a better way of living as opposed to the way that we have right now, as opposed to something they're just giving up, like having to put on a heavy sweater because Jimmy Carter told him to in 1978. One question that Wes asks is, how do we address corporate greenwashing of mining in particular? But I think we could talk about that more broadly, because I think you're starting to see corporations move away from the denial of climate change to kind of embracing it and then greenwashing themselves and what they're doing. How do we address the influence of industrial propaganda in our communities? That's what Wesley asked.
By any means possible. You know, you got to, I mean, you got to be in the media, you got to be challenging them, you got to be calling them out, you know, and then you got to be illustrating what the correct path is.
I'll give a parallel from the world of biofuels, which the US has a federal policy that requires for a biofuel to be eligible for the program, which basically translates into cash for people. So it's motivating. There is a life cycle greenhouse gas emissions threshold that the biofuel must be beneath. And so there's certain ways, there's certain data sources that are best to use, and the companies need to go through a process of approval with how they did their calculations and whatnot. And this is a relatively transparent process. And I think having a process like that around the carbon intensity, water intensity of a battery that's produced, for example, to be used in an EV would be a good thing. And that's in fact happening in Europe. So I think we could be adopting more life cycle assessment based targets and requirements that companies and others need to meet in a transparent way. You gotta tell us what you did to get to that.
Yeah, and as Winona said, just calling it out. I mean, this blue, we could call it blue washing too, because the fossil fuel industry creates this idea that we can have blue hydrogen where you create it from the methane and then you capture all the carbon and everything's good, or the same thing with ammonia. And people are finding, engineers and people doing life cycle analyses are finding that that's not the case at all. So we just need to watch what's going on and call it out. I don't know any other way.
There's a lot of questions in here too about growth, both in terms of economic growth and population growth. And I think, you know, we've been in a kind of, well, since the 70s, when there was a lot of discussion about population growth, the population bomb, the Ehrlich book, all that. We're actually reaching this moment in time now where suddenly I think we're actually contemplating peak human population on the planet. I mean, I think we're seeing it in places like China, where the one-child policy that they adopted in the 70s has really started to result in an aging population. You're seeing it here in the United States, where our population is now reaching almost a steady state and might start to decline. And I'm just wondering if you have thoughts about this question of whether we can continue to grow infinitely, or whether or not we actually have to start contemplating, you know, degrowth or steady state or some other kind of approach to both economic and population growth, and whether you have any thoughts about that. I know, again, a big topic, but worth grappling with a little bit. Yeah,
I mean, I think we've reached our carrying capacity, haven't we? you know, I mean, and the fact is though that an American is like a far more larger predator than somebody from Mexico, you know, but we're trying to replicate the economic system. So, you know, we definitely need to address population growth. And at some level, I have to say that the rising infertility in first world countries because of the contaminants and pollutants, you know, is part of what's, you know, it's, you know, I think that I think that we got a lot of challenges ahead.
Yeah, I think somebody said that infinite growth on a finite planet, whoever says that is either a madman or an economist, and it was an economist who said that. So we've clearly, you know, we have a box around us in terms of how much we can grow. And I know that a lot of that sometimes greenhouse gas emissions are maybe tied more closely to GDP than to population, as Winona was talking. But yeah, it seems that we've reached our carrying capacity and surpassed it in many countries.
I think for me, one thing that's interesting is how climate change will affect something like water scarcity. So, you know, by mass balance, we're not like, but we're going to lose access to water increasingly. And so that's just, you know, another planetary boundary that's going to be changing. So that we're moving the goalpost on some of these planetary boundaries. And I think that's just important to remember.
Yeah, and that's a lesson that we're getting, you know, in spades right now because of the drought in the Southwest and the desire to try to prop up what are really unsustainable water use issues in terms of the Oglala Aquifer, as well as the desert Southwest and all the population and agriculture that depends on an unsustainable amount of water. And the climate change that we're experiencing now is not going to make that any easier as we go along. Well, I'm sorry to look at the time. We are out of time. And I want to thank each of our panelists, Winona, LaDuke, Libby Bent, Jennifer Dunn. Fantastic perspectives, really interesting ways in which your work and your life's work kind of interact with each other's. And I really appreciate your ability to both navigate that kind of complexity and also interact with each other and learn from each other. So thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate it. I want to just cap this off by telling you that the Mind and the Climate Crisis webinar series is our last one for our current run of 3 webinars. But there's a whole host of information that is available to you on our website that's really helpful for navigating this question of where are we going to get the metals or other materials needed to navigate the climate crisis without destroying the environment that we're all here to protect. So on mncenter.org, there's also a link in the chat. You can explore fact sheets, you can explore some videos, you can explore recordings of the earlier webinars. And we really encourage you to ask questions and think deeply about this. I mean, I think part of the reason why we got to where we are in the climate crisis is our inability to think creatively and imaginatively about the ways in which we're going to address this issue. And we want you to share your perspective with us, share it with your elected representatives, so we can continue to make progress to addressing the climate crisis. And lastly, thank you for supporting our work. We really genuinely can't do it without you. We welcome your support. And if you're inclined to make a donation, please go to mncenter.org/donate. And it will help us support this kind of work in the future. So thanks again to our panelists, Dr. Bent, Dr. Dunn, and Winona LaDuke. And we thank you for your time today. And we hope you had a great lunch and enjoy your day. And we'll talk to you soon. Thanks very much.
Miigwech.
Bye.
Thank you all.